A recent paper evaluating AI platforms surfaced a highly alarming claim. Researchers bypassed provider security protocols to extract over 300 personally identifiable information artifacts and nearly 200 user credentials entirely through encrypted AI reasoning channels. Those raw numbers are technically accurate, but contextually misleading. They borrow scale from pre-existing developer carelessness and synthetic benchmark data to make the privacy risk appear more systemic than it is. The genuine discovery is not the data harvest itself, but the technical failure that allowed it. Researchers found that the specific mechanism designed to stop competitors from stealing advanced model reasoning has become a frictionless vector for doing exactly that. By standardizing how these blocks are handled across their entire infrastructure, providers essentially build a decryption oracle into their own ecosystems. This reliance on a universal encryption standard means the system deployed to lock down these traces simultaneously provides the tools necessary to open them. To understand the vulnerability, we have to look at why these channels exist. Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google stopped returning model reasoning in plaintext to prevent competitors from mass harvesting chain-of-thought data, a process that allows smaller models to learn from the logical patterns of larger ones. Under this new architecture, providers hand the client an opaque block of encrypted text. The client must then pass this exact block back to the server with every subsequent request, so the model can remember its own previous steps. For a competitor, the objective is to extract the reasoning trace of a frontier model, like GPT 5.6 or Claude Opus, without triggering the advanced anti-distillation filters that usually guard them. Researchers achieved this through what they call a scalable decryption jailbreak, a method that uses the provider's own infrastructure to turn those encrypted blocks back into readable text. The security of this system assumes that an opaque block is a safe block, but while the text is hidden from the user, it remains fully readable to the provider's internal decoders, and those decoders can be invoked by anyone with an API key. The exploit works because of cross-model compatibility. An encrypted reasoning blob is not mathematically tied to the specific model that created it. These blocks are authenticated at the broad provider level. If a block is signed by the provider's key, any model within that provider's ecosystem is authorized to decrypt and read it. To execute the attack, a user prompts a defended frontier model for a reasoning trace, returned as an encrypted token. If asked to transcribe it into plaintext, the defenses trigger and it refuses. Instead, the user ports that token to a weaker sibling model. Sibling models are optimized for speed and cost, often leaving out the heavy anti-distillation safeguards found in flagship models. The user prompts this undefended model to decode the block. Sharing the same keys, it decrypts the frontier model's logic and outputs the trace in plaintext. Because the ecosystem universally trusts its keys, competitors can steal intellectual property by routing requests through the most vulnerable model in the fleet. While the architectural vulnerability is consistent, the actual effort required to extract the data depends on the specific sibling model being targeted. Extracting reasoning from a model like Haiku 4.5 is trivial. Researchers found that a single fixed extraction prompt is enough to force the model to dump the entire plaintext trace. However, not every sibling is completely undefended. Extracting data from a model like GPT 5.6 Luna requires more specialized per-block engineering to bypass its partial safeguards. For Luna, the attack required ad hoc workarounds, like splitting the extraction into tiny chunks of under 50 tokens and using best-of-n sampling. The viability of the exploit is tied to the existence of an undefended entry point. If a provider hardens their cheap models, extraction friction increases significantly. For developers, this discovery changes the nature of session logs. Any encrypted reasoning block you share publicly is essentially a delayed release plaintext of your model's internal processing. In a sample of over 300,000 blocks, researchers recovered artifacts entirely absent from the visible chat history. This happens most often during conversation cleanup. When you ask an AI agent to anonymize a transcript, the model rereads the full history into its hidden reasoning. The sensitive values are removed from the final response, but they remain trapped in the encrypted payload where your scrub cannot reach them. Because users have no way to decrypt these blocks themselves, it is impossible to audit a session log for leaked credentials before publishing it to a repository. If you rely on these technical threat breakdowns to manage your AI deployments, please take a moment to subscribe. Sanitizing the visible user interface does nothing if the hidden architectural trace retains the data and can be decoded by any downstream observer. Actors can weaponize the opaque trace to hide malicious payloads from the platform's own safety checks. Hazardous content can sit in the reasoning channel, even when the model safely rejects a malicious request in the visible output. Most safety filters only look at the final output. They pass the safe response to the user, unaware that the hidden reasoning block contains the actual malicious payload. This creates a vector for invisible prompt injections that target public agentic rollouts. An attacker can embed instructions entirely within an encrypted block. Any agent that ingests that trajectory will process the poisoned reasoning without the user ever seeing the command. Treating an encrypted block as a safe black box creates a structural liability that can poison automated systems at scale. Now that we understand how the exploit works, we can look more closely at those headline-grabbing privacy numbers. The researchers scraped over 300,000 reasoning blocks from public GitHub and Hugging Face repositories. This exposure is the result of developers committing raw session logs to public repos. The attack decodes the blocks, but the initial vulnerability was the decision to share the logs in the first place. Furthermore, the most impressive-sounding numbers include synthetic data. Benchmarks like Clawbench provide models with fictitious personas and fake payment cards to reason over. When these are recovered by the attack, they count toward the PII totals, despite belonging to no real person. When you filter for genuine user sessions, the base rate is much smaller. Only 0.3% of the decoded blocks contained real user leakage, isolating the actual threat to 62 live API keys and a handful of passwords. While dozens of stolen credentials represent a serious security failure, the abstract's higher totals rely on a mix of real vulnerability and benchmark fiction to create an impression of scale. To address this, the researchers proposed a specific cryptographic mitigation to the major providers. The solution is cryptographic binding, mathematically locking every encrypted blob to the specific model, session, or user key that produced it. If the providers ship this patch, the vulnerability is only closed if a weak sibling, like Haiku, can no longer decode a blob generated by a frontier model. The biggest obstacle here is backward compatibility. Providers may be hesitant to break existing sessions that rely on portable blobs, potentially leaving a decryption window open for older clients. The ultimate test will be the performance of future competitor models. If new releases show the distinct logical structures of a frontier model they weren't licensed to learn from, it's a sign that distillation path is still active. If these blobs remain portable across the ecosystem, the protection of a frontier model's reasoning relies entirely on the security of its weakest sibling. Until cross-model compatibility is eliminated, that reasoning remains accessible to anyone with an API key and the right prompt.